anxiety, and confusion. In any case, our feelings will always tell us about the state of our relationship with the environment and point the way to what we need to learn to experience greater degrees of satisfaction. For example, if we aren't experiencing satisfaction in our personal relationships, would it be too simple to assume that the reason is because we haven't developed the appropriate interpersonal skills? Is it possible that there are certain communication skills available that, once learned and used, can result in much more satisfying personal relationships and deeper levels of intimacy? The problem is that it is just as easy to assume that the appropriate skills leading to greater levels of satisfaction don't exist, or that we already know what we need to know, and if we aren't experiencing satisfaction now, it must therefore not be possible to experience it at all. When we operate out of the last assumption, even if the environment presents us with evidence that deeper levels of satisfaction are possible, observing another couple who are experiencing satisfaction, we would probably assume that they are acting as if they were happy for appearance's sake. That way, we won't have to take responsibility for learning something they might know. The first assumption would result in investigation, learning, and expansion, leading to greater levels of effectiveness and satisfaction. The last two assumptions would obviously lead to more dissatisfaction. The names and places may change, but we will experience the same kind of painful conditions over and over again. These cycles of dissatisfaction will continue until we acknowledge there is something we need to learn and go about the task of learning it. What we already know will block what we haven't learned yet. Obviously, acknowledging there is something that we need to learn is not as easy as it sounds. In fact, acknowledging that we don't know something, or that what we do know isn't very useful or effective, presents us with one of the major paradoxes of life. The dilemma we are confronted with is, how can we know what we don't know when what we have already learned will block our perception of what we haven't learned yet? For example, once we learn that trading is easy, the first few quick winning trades will establish that belief. It will block our perception of information to the contrary, that trading is probably one of the hardest endeavors one could choose to undertake. Each of these beliefs, that trading is easy or trading is hard, would result in the perception of completely different choices as being available from the environment, resulting in variety for an outcome as be as et on the 𝐂𝐿 𝐻𝐵 and acted on. We don't question the usefulness or effectiveness of something we have already learned, simply because what each of us has learned we experienced in some way. That is, we won't question what we have experienced just because we experienced it, meaning the reality of the experience is based in our five senses. What is inside of us we either felt, saw, heard, smelled, or tasted. That's real enough. Once an experience becomes a component part of our mental environment in the form of a memory, belief, or association, it becomes a part of what is commonly believed to be our identity and beyond question. However, we are open to learn practically anything the environment has to offer. If we haven't been previously exposed in some way, we will soak up first-time information like a sponge, regardless of what it is. However, once it is inside of us, we will either defend it or defend against it, hide from information in the environment that we don't want to acknowledge as a part of our mental environment, instead of making ourselves available to learn more of what the environment has to offer in the way of insight about itself or ourself, as the case may be. To defend against the intrusion of information requires energy. This investment in energy is commonly referred to as stress. The simplest definition that I can think of for stress is that it is what we feel when we are actively blocking information from the environment. In physical terms, stress is really no different from walking against the wind. Symbolically, the wind would represent various categories of environmental information we don't want to confront. Our bodies walking against the wind would represent what we have already learned, what is already inside of us that blocks what is outside of us. The two forces clash and we feel stress. One of the biggest ironies of life is that everyone wants to be right. In other words, everyone assumes what they have experienced and learned about the nature of the way things exist to be the true and correct version. The irony is everyone's version is correct by virtue of the fact that what is inside all of us was experienced by our physical senses. If we saw it, if we read it, if we heard it, if we felt it, if we tasted it, if we smelled it, or any combination thereof, we experienced it. However, not everybody's version of what the environment has to offer in the way of experiences is particularly useful or effective as a resource for interacting with the environment in a way that would lead to satisfactory outcomes. Just because something gets input into our mental environment doesn't mean that it's of any real value in helping us to fulfill ourselves. A child has no way of conceptualizing how his experiences are forming beliefs about the nature of reality, concepts that would, in fact, be much different under different environmental conditions. He unquestioningly takes an experience as a fact of reality because the beliefs he is forming are founded in feelings and emotions. He does not reflect on his experiences to assess the quality of the beliefs he is forming. He has no way of determining how these beliefs will either act as resources or obstacles to self-expression in the future. The child doesn't understand that any belief that he forms will define reality in a way that excludes other possibilities, or that he will make associations with experiences, lumping components of the environment together in ways that are very limiting and not practical. Many of these beliefs will just naturally be decharged as his attractions cause him to interact with the environment in new ways. All of us will just naturally grow into a new set of limitations as we expand our awarenesses by learning, which in turn releases us from things we used to believe. However, if the quality of the energy in many of our beliefs is negatively charged, then our fear will act as an obstacle to self-expression, limiting what we can perceive from the environment as possibilities. For example, someone who grew up constantly being belittled or criticized by his parents knows exactly how that feels. The beliefs he forms about himself and his relationship with the environment, as a result, were formed in a reality of pain. Certainly he wouldn't know, while growing up, that he was forming a belief about his relative unworthiness as a person. Unworthiness is a concept that he may not learn about well into his adult years, and he may never learn how to release himself from the damaging effects. But in the meantime, his fear of being ridiculed and belittled will drastically limit the possibilities he perceives in the environment for self-expression. Many possibilities that seem self-evident to someone without this fear would be totally out of the realm of possibility for him. An even bigger irony is that the more we acknowledge the possibility that our version of the way things exist isn't as effective of a resource as it could be, the more we make ourselves available to learn from the environment. By expanding our personal dot to include more of what is outside of us inside of us, the more it increases our level of correspondence with the outside, leaving less and less of what is out there that we don't know about, thereby increasing our ability to be right. The more we allow ourselves to learn, the better able we are at making assessments about the probabilities that exist in some future moment. How could we not be better off by learning something when you consider that the environment can act as a force on us in an almost infinite variety of ways, some of which we know about, many others we couldn't begin to anticipate unless we keep on learning in spite of what we already know. The more we believe we know, the more we make the environment prove to us that what we know isn't particularly useful or effective. The problem is that proof could be right in front of our noses and we wouldn't have the mental framework to recognize it, unless we willingly allowed ourselves to confront it and consider it. Otherwise, if we all knew so much, we would never experience emotional pain, because it is a perfect indication that we don't know how to interact with the environment to our satisfaction. Because if we did, we would. All this should be somewhat apparent because it is not a typical human characteristic to actively gather and consider information that conflicts with what we already know and believe to be true. However, consider that hidden within the environmental information that we haven't learned to perceive yet, either because we haven't learned to make the appropriate distinctions or because the information is being blocked by our current set of beliefs, are a more appropriate set of steps to fulfilling ourselves. What we haven't learned yet is outside of each one of us waiting to become a part of our personal dot. What we don't know represents all the information that could result in choices that have much more satisfying outcomes. However, since we can't know what we haven't learned yet and what we do know blocks the perception of other alternatives that exist for satisfaction, we easily get caught in these terribly unsatisfying life cycles, believing that is all the world has to offer, when our predicament is merely the result of our inability to adapt ourselves. When we do allow ourselves to adapt, we learn that there are always more choices available than our beliefs will allow us to perceive. What I mean by adapt is to identify and actively change something that is already inside of us so there is a higher degree of correspondence between the inside and outside. Each first-time experience with the physical environment creates a distinction in the mental environment about its nature. All information or possibilities that exist in the same category as that first experience will then be filtered perceptually through what we learn from that experience. Again, I will use the example of a child whose first experience with a dog is a painful one, meaning that the first dog the child attempted to play with out of his natural sense of curiosity, bit him. As a result of this one experience, the child will naturally associate all dogs with the one that bit him. What he learned will then act as a mental barrier to anything else the environment may have to offer with respect to all other dogs. I have used the words naturally associate to point out that the child will not have to actively think about the limiting way in which dogs will be characterized in his mental environment. The associations will occur automatically, as a natural function of the way our minds are wired. So he will not have to see the dog that bit him. Any dog will cause him to remember the pain of his previous experience. As a result of his first experience with a dog being painful, he will automatically associate any future encounters with dogs with his one painful experience. regardless of how erroneous his association is or how the environment may try to prove to him that most dogs are friendly and will not cause him pain, he won't believe it, because what he has already learned about dogs, not one dog, but all dogs, will cause him to block the acceptance of this new information into his mental system. However, if the child's first experience with a dog is positive, he will obviously have no reservations to play with any dog until he has a painful experience. In this case, however, if he is bitten, he will not automatically associate all other dogs with the one that bit him because he has already learned that the environment has more to offer than this one painful experience. What he will learn, that is new for him, is that not all dogs are friendly and that he must use some caution when interacting with them until he can determine their disposition. The child whose first experience was painful doesn't know that he can experience happiness and joy with dogs. He doesn't know it because he hasn't experienced it. It isn't something he has learned yet, regardless of the evidence the environment may be presenting him. Nor will he likely learn it until he is willing to step through his fear. All other information being offered to him about the nature of dogs will be blocked or rejected by the energy of what he has already learned. You can teach a child anything you please, regardless of how erroneous or dysfunctional it is relative to the environmental conditions. The child will believe what you teach him because what he experiences becomes a part of his identity. Anything we experience will become a functioning part of our identity. When I say functioning, I mean that once something is inside of us, regardless of what it is, it then has the potential to act as a force on our behavior. All these functioning parts that we call memories of experiences, beliefs, and associations, in turn then act as an internal force to shape our perception of the environment we experience out of what is available to experience. As you already know, what each one of us fears as individuals is something that we have at some point in our lives learned to fear, as a result of our experiences. When we feel fear, it is because we have learned to perceive the environmental conditions as threatening in some way, whereas someone who hasn't had a painful experience associated with those same environmental conditions has learned to perceive the environment conditions in a completely different way, a way that corresponds with his previous experience. One person can perceive the conditions as a threat, the other as an opportunity, in the same moment, based on what is already inside of them. In other words, what they have already taken into their mental environment as experience will determine how they perceive the environmental conditions, whether as an opportunity to experience joy or as a threat to experience pain and all the degrees in between. What is really interesting is that neither one would be able to convince the other of the validity of his perception, because what they are experiencing at the moment is directly related to what they have already learned. We will usually only question the value of something that is inside of us, if we are forced to, as an absolute last resort. What would be the ultimate proof that we need to finally make us acknowledge that there is something we need to learn? Pain. We will acknowledge the need to learn when we are experiencing the emotional pain of a great disappointment or stress and anxiety because we don't know what to do next, and we are finding it increasingly difficult to shift the responsibility for what we are ending up with. If we go back to the believing that trading is easy example, why would we consider that trading is difficult when we already know that it is easy? What would cause us to question the usefulness of such a belief? The emotional pain of disappointment as a result of not being able to achieve our goals? Once we question the usefulness, what happens? A whole world of information opens up to us on how we can learn to interact with the trading environment more effectively by increasing our level of correspondence. However, everything we would find in the environment to increase our understanding already existed, unless we think of something completely new on our own. The only thing that stopped us from finding it before was the energy of what we already knew, blocking what we haven't learned yet. The problem is that if learning something new means that we have to change what we have already learned, we instinctively seem to refuse to do it, regardless of how inappropriate what we have learned may be relative to what we would need to know to experience satisfaction. Once we have learned something, it will act as a force to block other information that would result in the perception of other choices. Even children will resist the acceptance of information that is contrary to what they have already learned, regardless of how dysfunctional their knowledge may be. All learning is synonymous with change, whether we are changing something we already know or learning something completely new. If we refuse to change, adapt, the inside, adding to what we know to create more distinctions and change our perspective, then we are not learning what we need to know to experience something different in the outer environment. If there is no change on the inside, there will be no perceived change in the outside, thereby locking us into recurring cycles of pain and dissatisfaction. What's more, we will continue to suffer until the pain becomes so great that we are left with no choice other than to reassess how we go about managing our lives, that is, reassessing the usefulness of our beliefs. What we do know becomes obsolete. Besides the cycles of dissatisfaction that our current set of limitations locks us into, what we know blocks what we haven't learned yet, there is an even more practical reason for learning how to adapt. All of us are forced to interact with a constantly changing physical environment to fulfill our needs and achieve our goals. The way we interact with the environment, what choices we perceive in relationship to what is actually available from the environment's perspective, and what we do in relationship to what we perceive are all a function of what we have learned. Now, if you will recall, everything that constitutes the physical environment is in constant motion. Anything that is in motion, which includes everything made of atoms and molecules, is also changing over time. So change is an automatic function of the physical environment. However, the mental environment is composed of positively or negatively charged energy that carries information about our experiences. What we have learned that forms into organizational patterns that we call beliefs and concepts about the nature of the physical environment. Energy is not made of atoms and molecules and therefore does not change over time. In fact, energy exists in a non-physical dimension outside of time as we perceive it with our senses. Electrical energy or chemically produced electrical energy can be stored just the same as in a battery and the information it carries is stored with it. That is, time has no effect on the quality of this energy, the degree of the positive or negative charge, and the ways in which it affects our perception of environmental information and how it acts as a force on our behavior. Changing our mental environment to correspond with the constant external changes going on in the physical environment is not automatic. The information stored in our mental environment about the nature of the physical environment can remain unchanged for years or a lifetime, for that matter, regardless of how outdated, useless, or even harmful it may be. And furthermore, this outdated knowledge will continue to act as a force on our behavior, causing us to interact with the environment in completely inappropriate ways relative to the conditions. So even if we are experiencing satisfaction in certain areas of our lives, we cannot take it for granted that the conditions that we have learned to interact with will stay as we know them to exist. The outside conditions are in constant motion, presenting us with different forces to learn about and adapt to. In the market environment, for example, the changes in conditions are highly visible and usually moment to moment, whereas in other types of environments that we typically operate in, the forces of change work a little slower and are less visible, but they are changing nevertheless. The problem is that the conditions will change and we won't necessarily recognize these changes even if we start to experience some degree of dissatisfaction, unless we are constantly vigilant that even though we have learned something that works, it can still become obsolete. Chapter 12. The dynamics of goal achievement. The extent to which we fulfill our needs and achieve our goals with any degree of satisfaction is, first, a function of our being able to recognize our needs and formulate our goals. This is not as simple as it sounds. Our natural sense of curiosity and our attractions are very powerful inner forces that create a state of need or put us in a state of imbalance with the physical environment until the needs are satisfied. When we feel these attractions to certain activities, people, or objects in the environment, it is often difficult to visualize the possibilities or formulate any plans because of other inner forces in the form of beliefs, associations, or memories that act as barriers. We need to understand the relationship and possible conflicts between what we need or feel very attracted to and these other inner forces that in a sense say no. The extent to which we fulfill our needs and achieve our goals with any degree of satisfaction is, second, a function of the degree to which we understand the nature of the external environmental forces we have to interact with to fulfill our needs and achieve our goals. The depth of our understanding will correlate directly with the way in which we express ourselves in the environment to create the effect that we want. Third, it is a function of the repertoire of skills that we have developed to interact with the environment and, fourth, a function of our ability to execute those skills. Any differences between what we wanted, expected, desired, or needed and what we got is simply an indication of the degree to which we haven't learned what we needed to know or evidence that we don't have the appropriate skills to do what needed to be done. Included as a factor in the first category, where we haven't learned what we needed to know, is our ability or lack thereof to objectively, without illusion, assess the availability of what we wanted or needed from the environment's perspective. In other words, what we wanted may have not been available to begin with or available in the quantity we wanted or in the time frame we wanted or needed, and we didn't have the mental framework to make the kinds of distinctions to indicate the actual availability beforehand. We also have to consider that what we wanted may have actually been available but unperceivable, as a result of not having learned to make the appropriate distinctions, which would, in turn, give us the kind of perspective where we could notice its availability. In these kinds of situations we usually end up saying to ourselves, I wish, or if only I had known that then, When we find out afterward, what we didn't know at the time would have made a difference on how we saw things. Often, however, we never find out that what we wanted and didn't get was only one minor shift in perspective. Not knowing, of course, that the reason why we didn't get it was because we just didn't know there was something more we needed to learn. If we had the mental framework to make the appropriate distinctions, we can assume that we would have, unless something was blocking our perception. I might add here that when we interact with other people, if we use force and manipulation to get what otherwise would be unavailable, what we are doing is forcing them to behave outside of their beliefs. If their beliefs were consistent with what we wanted from them, then we wouldn't need to use force or manipulation because a state of harmony would exist. We don't need to use force or manipulation on someone to do something that they already believe in. Whenever we do, it creates a state of imbalance in them that they would normally rectify by some means of revenge that we would just have to deal with at some point in the future. As a general observation of the human condition that goes along with this, most of us spend our lives trying to change what is in front of us to suit the makeup of our inner environment, when all we need to do is change the way we think about what is in front of us and we will change the quality of our experience of it. In the second category, where we don't have the appropriate skills to do what needed to be done, we may recognize the most appropriate set of steps to take and also objectively assess the availability of what we want, but that doesn't mean that we have the skills to execute those steps. It is possible to underestimate the skills required in relation to the conditions to accomplish what we want, i.e., we don't know any better, or we could overestimate our abilities in relation to the conditions. Furthermore, even if we have learned the appropriate skills, there may be any number of beliefs or fears that act as barriers or limiting forces that will prevent us from properly executing the steps leading to what we want to accomplish. These beliefs or fears can be something that we have a conscious awareness of, or they can be completely subconscious. I am defining subconscious as any experience that we don't have immediate access to with our conscious thought process. For example, someone could be afraid of going into the water, be conscious of the fear itself, but not have the slightest recollection of a painful experience associated with water to know why he can't express himself in that way. There is a very important distinction here that you need to make between recollection and memories. What we experience in the environment becomes a memory. Our ability to bring that memory into our conscious thought process is recollection. Some memories are easy to recall because the pathways to wherever the memory is stored are used a lot. In other words, we remember how to remember certain memories. However, there are many other experiences that become subconscious. These are memories that we have either forgotten how to remember because we don't use the pathways or we were never really fully aware of what was being perceived by our senses in the first place. However, the point here is that none of what goes into the mental environment disappears or no longer exists just because we don't remember it. Our ability to recall consciously any particular belief that we are taught as a child or our ability to recall any particular experience is not a factor in the dynamics of how any of these mental components act as a force on our behavior. Neither is physical clock time for that matter. Our conscious recollection of experiences may fade with time, but time has no impact on the electrical charge, quality of energy, or the amount of emotional force behind the charge. For example, the old adage that time heals all wounds is not applicable to the mental environment. Time will heal wounds to the body because the body is a part of a physical reality where everything is in motion and changing over time. However, time has no impact on the memories stored in our mental environment because the mental environment is not composed of physical matter. It is composed of stored energy that does not change with the passing of time. Emotional wounds, negatively charged mental energy, will never go away unless we learn how to release ourselves from them or change them. People think time heals emotional wounds, because after years of experiences they either inadvertently let go of the pain or build a system of beliefs as a defense to shield themselves from it. In fact, our seemingly infinite capacity to resist acknowledging the injury and hiding the effects of emotional wounds makes them very elusive. We almost always know when we have injured our bodies in some way. If you break your leg, you know it because you won't be able to walk. If it doesn't heal properly, you will know that too because you won't be able to walk the same as before or it may still hurt to walk. Yet, emotional wounds are not always so self-evident, because we can always structure our beliefs to make it seem as if we are not responsible for the cycles of dissatisfaction and emotional pain we experience in our lives, thus insulating ourselves from the effects of our own negatively charged energy. This is being pointed out because I have found that most people have a great deal of difficulty believing that something that happened to them in their childhood can still affect how they perceive their environment and how they express themselves now. Although, when you think about it, how could it be any other way? Everything that we experience becomes a component part of our mental environment. All the parts then act as an inner cause, affecting how we experience the outside environment. Again, we don't have to be able to remember why we learned to be afraid of something to feel the fear. We don't even have to consciously acknowledge to ourselves that the fear exists, because we can always rationalize that it is something else or use drugs or alcohol to block our awareness of it. However, regardless of how hard we try to stop ourselves from feeling what is inside of us, the feelings are still there, otherwise our efforts to block them wouldn't be necessary in the first place. The fear will exist because the energy, somewhere in our memory of some previous experience, will cause us to feel it, regardless of whether or not we allow ourselves to have a recollection of the source. Memories, beliefs, and associations do not go away with time, substance abuse, or trying to put them somewhere in the subconscious that makes it more difficult to gain a conscious awareness. They will continue to act as a source of energy for the way in which we pick and choose information from the environment and how we express ourselves, for as long as we live, unless we learn how to manage them. Did you ever wonder why it was so difficult to break an unwanted habit, or why it can be so difficult to execute some well-thought-out plan you were really committed to? It is difficult because of what is already inside of us that acts as resistance to our intent. An intent to do something is not necessarily a belief. In other words, out of everything we intend to do, some of those intentions will be supported by our beliefs, memories, and associations, and some will not. When there is support, our efforts will seem effortless, because there is no conflict between any beliefs, memories, and associations and what we intend to do. However, if our intents are not in harmony with our beliefs, memories, or associations, doing becomes a struggle, where we can't stay focused, become easily distracted, or make what most people would characterize as stupid mistakes. Take, for example, someone who smokes, decides it's a bad habit, and as a result, commits himself to quitting. Thus his intent is to express himself as a non-smoker. However, after he has smoked his last cigarette, his beliefs in being a smoker will immediately start drawing his attention to cigarettes until it builds to the point where he craves a cigarette and then has one. What we have here is a classic conflict between an intent that is not only in conflict with other beliefs, but the intent itself has no real structural support. That is, there isn't a corollary belief that says, I am a non-smoker. The energy for his behavior not to smoke will have to come from his conscious willingness to be a different person in this area of his life. However, his willingness doesn't instantly negate all the energy and the beliefs he has built up over the years in being a smoker. These beliefs will have a great deal of energy to act on his conscious attention, noticing cigarettes in the environment and thinking about cigarettes, and his behavior, to pick one up and smoke it. We could even have inner support, beliefs, memories, and associations, for what we intend to do, and still have difficulties following through with our plans because of other conflicting beliefs. Behavior that would fall into the stupid mistake category is most often the result of subconscious or forgotten beliefs that are in direct conflict with our intents. Trading is a perfect example to illustrate this. Many people devote a great deal of their time, energy, and financial resources to expressing themselves as traders. They learn a lot about trading. They are even highly regarded by their peers for what they know about the market, but still can't execute their trades properly or the way they planned. There are traders who can consistently make money day after day until they get to certain threshold levels and then promptly give all their profits back to the market in one or two trades. The way they give their money back is completely inconsistent with their trading style while they were making money. After they have lost a sufficient amount of money, they go back to the way they normally trade and start the process all over again. This kind of behavior is no accident. It happens for a reason. In each of these situations, these traders certainly had developed effective, workable strategies to be successful. They definitely had some highly structured beliefs to support their expression as a trader. However, what they haven't done is identify and decharge a whole host of other beliefs, both conscious and subconscious, that are in direct conflict with the endeavor of trading or making money as a trader. For example, there are many beliefs related to one's religious upbringing that are in direct conflict with the whole concept of speculating. And what is trading but taking money away from other traders with no services rendered? This kind of activity isn't consistent with most religious teachings. Another typical example is most people grow up with very powerful beliefs related to the work ethic. They have very rigid definitions about what constitutes work and how one earns one's money. Trading doesn't exactly fit into most of these definitions either. So regardless of how highly developed one's trading strategies become, the act of trading will still violate the integrity of any belief that is in conflict with the act of trading or making money from trading. Eventually, the unexpressed energy accumulating in these conflicting beliefs will build to the point where the trader will find himself behaving in a manner completely inconsistent with his trading rules or intent to make money. Often, he will even be aware that he is about to make a trading error, watch himself do it, and at the same time either feel powerless to stop himself or won't stop himself until he has lost enough money to compensate for the imbalance in his mental environment. Now, when these kinds of things happen, if we don't understand what is going on, it could cause us to feel inadequate in some way, if we judge ourselves harshly, or we could be overcome by a sense of powerlessness and fear because we seemingly have no control over these unidentified internal forces that can exert so much control over our behavior. Without any awareness of the problem or effective tools for dealing with it, most people will attempt to build mental barriers to try and block these forces from manifesting in their behavior. Obviously, they don't work, which makes the whole situation even scarier. This is where the substance abuse comes into play. For example, a person who is an alcoholic knows he is a heavy drinker. At the most fundamental level, a person drinks obsessively to separate his intellect from these inner forces he believes he has no control over. The more he blocks, the more the forces build and the more he has to drink to block. The more he drinks, the more everything deteriorates in his outer environment as a reflection of his inner environment. Eventually, the physical environment, his body, or both deteriorates so badly that he can no longer block the true state of his condition. He then acknowledges that yes, I am an alcoholic, and I need to change, meaning that yes, I need to address the issues in my life that caused me to start drinking in the first place. The point of all this is, learning how to forget our painful memories or ignoring the existence of beliefs that don't support our intents does not in any way reduce their potential to cause us to behave in certain ways. If we want to change unwanted behavior, we have to change the internal source of that behavior. Releasing ourselves from the limitations of our fears by healing our emotional wounds, changing the polarity of a belief, or decharging it altogether is something that we have to learn how to do by learning how to manage mental energy. If people knew of some way of managing their beliefs, memories, and associations, then the kind of painful cycles of forced awareness described earlier would never get started in the first place. Thus far I have identified three forces in constant operation in our lives. First are all the external environmental forces that have the potential to act as a cause, where we, as individuals, experience an effect. Some of these outside environmental forces we will have some degree of understanding of and others we will not. Our degree of understanding and insight along with the extent to which we can act on what we know is directly proportional to the degree of satisfaction we will experience as we interact with the environment to fulfill our needs and achieve our goals. Implied within all the external forces, whether we understand them or not, are all the forces of change that automatically alter everything made of atoms and molecules, consequently making what we do know, in terms of usefulness, obsolete at some point in time. For example, the chair you are sitting in to read this book is deteriorating over time. At some point it will no longer be able to support any weight, making your belief in its stability obsolete. Second are the deep inner forces of curiosity and attraction that compel us to explore, learn about, and interact with the environment in seemingly predetermined ways. For example, there are things that we are naturally interested in learning about or learning how to do in relationship to all the other things that are available to learn about in the environment, but we have no natural interest, like someone who always wanted to be a musician, firefighter, actor, or doctor and pursues these vocations, resulting in feelings of deep satisfaction about their lives. However, if the environment forces us into areas where there is no natural interest, we will experience an emptiness that can be very difficult to identify, only that it feels like something is missing in our lives. What each of us as individuals is naturally curious about and attracted to in the environment come from the deepest levels of our existence. They act as very powerful forces of self-expression, compelling us to create in the physical environment the object of our imagination or to pursue in the physical environment the object of our interests, often in direct conflict with outside environmental forces as well as inner mental forces in the form of what we have been taught to believe. Third are the mental forces represented by our beliefs, memories, and associations. Even though beliefs, memories, and associations are mental forces, they are not the same as the forces of curiosity and attraction. Beliefs, memories, and associations exist exclusively as a result of the kinds of experiences we have with the physical environment. This is in contrast to the forces of curiosity and attraction that are in us before we are born and would seem to be either predetermined in a spiritual sense or genetically encoded. Some of our beliefs, memories, and associations will act as positive resources for interacting with the physical environment effectively and with some degree of satisfaction. Others, however, will have just the opposite effect. Many of our beliefs, memories, and associations are resources for failure, pain, and dissatisfaction because they lock us into only perceiving what we already know as well as cutting us off from our natural sense of curiosity. In other words, They specifically act as forces to prevent any further mental growth. Now, since we have to interact with the physical environment to fulfill our needs and achieve our goals, the key to doing it to assure ourselves of experiencing greater levels of satisfaction is to acquire deeper levels of insight and understanding into the nature of these forces. That is, we need to stay in a constant state of learning. The only thing that really stops us from continuing to learn about the nature of these outside forces is the mental forces in the form of beliefs, memories, and associations that build up and as a result block our natural sense of curiosity, sometimes to the point of shutting down the learning process altogether. There is some element of truth to the saying that you can't teach an old dog new tricks, except that it should really read an old dog won't learn new tricks. It's not that it is impossible for someone regardless of their age to learn something new, the issue is an ability. It is more a matter of resistance and refusal. That refusal comes from the sum total of everything we already believe, in essence saying, forget it, I already know everything I need to know. Of course, the consequences to such a stance toward the environment can be and often are devastating, and it invariably always takes some truly devastating event or a series of them before someone who has this kind of attitude will acknowledge that the reason for their plight is that they just refuse to allow any changes in their mental environment. Of course, this know-it-all attitude is very easy to recognize in someone else. The trick is learning how to recognize it ourselves, because it exists in all of us as a natural function of the ways in which beliefs, memories, and associations manage information. To stay in a constant state of learning, we need to learn how to adapt. To adapt, we need to learn some specific mental techniques on how to consciously apply our thoughts to upgrade, modify, replace, or change the polarity, electrical charge, of various components in our mental environment that act as limiting or inhibiting forces on our perception and behavior, preventing us from gaining greater levels of correspondence with the physical environment. By consciously adapting, we are making ourselves available to learn how to fulfill our needs and achieve our goals in increasingly more satisfying ways. Note, implied within fulfilling our needs and achieving our goals is the need to explore the object of our curiosities and attractions, which also get blocked by our beliefs, associations, and memories. To adapt, we need to choose not to resist learning and change. This requires a willingness on our part to think outside of the limitations established by our beliefs, associations, and memories, and a willingness to learn how to manage mental energy so we can release ourselves from the negative effects of our painful memories. When we learn how to change the polarity of a painful memory, it isn't painful any longer. When the memory is decharged or drained of the negatively charged energy, it will no longer have the potential to generate fear. Fear always limits the number of choices we perceive as available from the environment by the way it causes us to focus our attention on the object of our fear. The net effect is we end up creating for ourselves exactly what we are trying to avoid. It is important for you to note that, when we change the polarity of a memory, it doesn't actually change the structure of the memory. In other words, we don't forget the experience, so we can still use it as a part of our repertoire of what we know about the nature of the physical environment. When we change the quality of energy of a memory from negative to positive, we negate the memory's potential to generate fear, thereby allowing us to perceive all the other choices for experience available from the environment in the same moment. Preferably, this willingness to change will come from somewhere other than out of desperation. The idea is to learn how to recognize what we need to know long before the conditions deteriorate to the levels of desperation. To do this requires that we incorporate into our mental system three very fundamental assumptions that will help us to maintain a healthy relationship with the environment and generate the energy behind the willingness that we will need to start such a process, after which experiencing the benefits will act as the driving force behind our willingness. The first assumption is that we haven't learned everything there is to know, and, as a result, there are always going to be unknown forces acting upon us until our understanding of everything outside of us evolves to the point where we have simultaneous awareness of everything going on in the environment. The implications here are that we need to be in a constant state of learning from the moment we are born to the moment we die, because our intellect has not yet evolved to the point of simultaneous perception of all information that is available in any given moment. Until then, we are forced to pick and choose the information we experience based on what we have learned to believe. The second assumption is that what we have learned to believe, either by force, unwillingly thrust upon us, as an expression of the outside environment, or by choice, as an expression of inner forces that operate within us like our curiosity and attractions, may not be very useful with respect to fulfilling ourselves in some satisfying manner. The third assumption is that what we have learned that is useful and works to our satisfaction is still subject to change because of the changing environmental conditions. In other words, What we may need to know to experience more satisfaction and happiness in our lives will often have to replace partially or invalidate completely what we have already learned. Refusing to change what we have already learned is virtually the same as saying that we already know everything there is to know and don't need to learn anything further. Of course, we could easily know if we didn't need to adapt because we would be in a perpetual state of satisfaction. Anything less than a feeling of satisfaction from our inner the perfection of the moment. If you operate out of the foregoing assumptions, you will begin to recognize how every moment becomes a perfect indication of your state of development and what you need to do to improve yourself. For example, let's look at a hypothetical trader whose goal is to make money from his trading. He perceives what he believes to be an opportunity to do so and puts on a trade. However, he is operating out of a fear of being wrong. As a result, his fear will act on his perception of information to block from his awareness any evidence that would indicate that he is wrong. Remember that fear is a natural mechanism to warn us of threatening conditions so that we can avoid them. Now, what is threatening about being wrong? In this case, as in most all cases, it is all the accumulated pain and humiliation inside of him from his past experiences. If the market, or anyone else for that matter, presents him with any information that conflicts with what he wants, his fear will cause him to distort it perceptually, or he will angrily scream at the person who offered such information, "Don't tell me that," so that he can avoid feeling the pain already inside of him from his past. In effect, his fears will create for him the very experience that he is trying to avoid because he is avoiding information that would indicate what the markets have to offer in relationship to what he wants or expects. If the market does move against him, he probably won't confront the evidence until the pain of doing so is less than the pain of not confronting it, meaning that his losses accumulate to the point where it is easier to admit he is wrong than to suffer any more losses. The results of our efforts will be reflected in the environment as the sum total of who we are in any given moment, as it was for our trader in the foregoing example. A goal is an intent that we have projected out into the environment. It is a need to be fulfilled in some future moment. The need arises out of a recognition of some lack. Recognizing the need automatically focuses our attention to scan the environment for ways, paths, to fulfill that need. The environmental information we perceive, quality and depth of insight, will be a function of the number of distinctions we can make minus any information that gets blocked by any fears we are operating out of. How we express ourselves to fulfill the need will be function of 1. Our perceptions, 2. The steps that we choose as a result of those perceptions, and 3. The skills we have developed minus any conflicting beliefs, memories, and associations, making each moment that we interact with the environment a perfect indication of what we know and how well we can act on what we know. When we refuse to acknowledge or accept the perfection of each moment in our lives, we deny ourselves access to the information that we need to expand ourselves. Any skill that we need to learn to express ourselves more effectively has a true starting point. To find that true starting point requires our acceptance of each outcome as a reflection of the sum total of who we are, so that we can first identify what skill needs to be learned and how we might go about the task of learning it. Without this true starting point, we will operate from a base of illusion. Illusions result from beliefs that we know more than we do and can do more than we can. We erroneously assume the environment shares our perception of it or of ourselves, and then we actively block any information to the contrary. Illusions are the difference between accepting each moment as a perfect indication of who we are so that we can identify what we need to learn to move forward, and believing we are already perfect the way we are, in which case we need learn nothing. Certainly, if any of us were in a perfect state of knowledge and abilities, then we would never need to complain about anything or make excuses, rationalizations, or justifications for why things didn't turn out as we planned. Every should have, could have, would have, or if only is an indication of the degree of illusion in which we are indulging ourselves. If we could have, we would have, meaning that at each moment we are doing the best we can when taking into account all the components, both conscious and subconscious, that affect what we perceive and do. Acknowledging and accepting this perfection will always give us our true starting point to indicate what we need to learn so that we can perceive the conditions differently, or what resources we need to develop to respond differently. If our hypothetical trader wants to develop into an effective and consistently successful trader, he will need to engage in some self-improvement. He will need to understand that the market is always right and that he can profit from that tightness if he doesn't impose a rigid mental structure on its behavior. He needs to release himself from his fear of being wrong so that he can observe the market's behavior from an objective perspective. Otherwise, his fear of being wrong will have the effect of making him wrong. He will also need to establish some definite trading rules to guide his own behavior and learn how to adhere to those rules. If he had been operating out of a definite set of trading rules, he would have never let the loss accumulate sufficiently that his pain would take him out of the trade. If, however, he refuses to acknowledge and accept his current state of development by blaming the market for his losses or trying to convince himself that somehow he wasn't responsible for what he ended up with, then he would be indulging himself in illusion. He would be denying who he is and, in effect, cutting himself off from the information he needs to become who he wants to be. We have to be willing to confront the truth about ourselves so that we can confront the truth outside of ourselves. The less illusion we indulge ourselves in, the more our perceptions of the outside environment will reflect the actual conditions, because we won't be blocking so much available information. By available information I mean information we are capable of perceiving. The less we block, the more we learn. The more we learn, the easier it is to anticipate how the outside environment will react or respond under any given set of conditions. Otherwise, we will not allow ourselves to perceive in the environment what we refuse to know about ourselves. None of us likes to acknowledge what we perceive to be our weaknesses, yet it is exactly what we need to do to grow beyond them. Otherwise, we keep building our lives on this base of illusion that requires so much energy, alcohol, or drugs to maintain that it eventually has to crumble, leading to these very painful forced awarenesses. Confronting the truth in the environment or the truth about ourselves is no more painful than are the forced awarenesses that result from these illusions. It's just more immediate. However, when we do confront what is inside of us, it is the first step in the process of breaking a cycle of dissatisfaction to turn it into an expansive cycle of success. What better form of goal achievement could there be than to confront conditions as they exist, identify what we need to learn to operate most effectively, and then go about the task of learning it, making our adjustments along the way? All traders give themselves exactly what they deserve. Traders put on trades and then take them off when they choose. That decision-making process is the result of the sum total of all the mental components interacting with one another. If we were to inventory all these components, measure the energy they hold, and then balance the components that contribute to a positive sense of self-valuation against the components that contribute to a negative sense of self-valuation, what would be left is a net amount that we value ourselves. This net amount will correspond directly with how much money we give ourselves out of what is available in any given trade, in any day, month, or year, or by the same token how much of our money we give away. I know that this can be a very difficult concept to accept. However, other than taking into account what we haven't learned yet in terms of insights and skills, how could it be any other way? We make up all our own rules when we trade. No one forces us in or out of the markets, unless a position is liquidated by a brokerage firm for lack of margin. In any given trade, there are a number of possibilities to take profits or cut losses. What we decide to do in each instance with respect to each possibility will be the result of our perceptions and all the internal components affecting those perceptions. What we actually end up doing will be the result of what we decide and our ability to execute our decisions, which again will be determined by a number of mental factors, all of which contribute to our sense of self-valuation. Trading is an exercise in accumulating money. Once we have learned how to trade, perceive opportunity and execute our trades, who else or what else could be responsible for what we end up with? In fact, if traders were to chart their equity, it would reflect their internal conflicts and what they think of themselves on a day-to-day, month-to-month, or year-to-year basis. These charts would look very much like the typical bar or point and figure charts of the markets themselves, with support and resistance levels, consolidation zones, rallies, sell-offs, and retracements. All these patterns would reflect the trader's state of mind, just as the markets themselves reflect the collective state of mind of all its participants. Charts like these also can have the same predictive value as in the markets, if one learns what to look for. Some of the more sophisticated brokerage firms that manage large funds keep these kinds of charts on the CTAs that they employ to trade their money under management. They will switch the amount of equity available for each CTA to manage based on each individual's chart formations. In other words, once you build up some history, it isn't too difficult to determine when someone is about to take a big hit because of the psychological forces building inside of him, just as the collective forces of the market build before a big move. As individual traders, if we want to give ourselves more and more money out of the markets, we have to learn how to value ourselves more and more so that we believe we deserve what we want or deserve what we get. Trading can result in the fast accumulation of windfall profits. To keep those profits, we have to have inner support. Most of the time, that support doesn't exist, and that accounts for all the rags to riches stories that can be told in the trading world. Of course, the first step in the process of valuing ourselves more is to accept our true starting point. That is, we have to take complete responsibility for what we end up with as being a reflection of what we need to learn about the markets, about ourselves, or both. Ultimately, Everything that we do contributes to or detracts from our sense of self-valuation. That is why it can fluctuate from day to day or moment to moment. The best way that I know of to add to our sense of valuation is to commit ourselves to the process of growth. Chapter 13. Managing Mental Energy. What do I mean by managing mental energy, you ask? There are many ways that we already manage mental energy but probably wouldn't think of it in such a way. For example, isn't it possible to take what starts out to be a slight emotional wound, like some minor insult, and intensify the emotional energy behind that wound to the point where we could end up in a state of emotional frenzy? How do we accomplish this? By our willingness to think about whatever caused us to feel insulted. Our thoughts can add energy to or detract energy from the wound, depending on what kind of thoughts we choose to think. If we think destructive thoughts, we will be adding negatively charged energy to intensify the wound. And it goes without saying that we can carry this to whatever extreme we choose and, furthermore, stop whenever we choose or whenever we are willing to. However, stopping does become more difficult in direct proportion to the amount of energy involved. Aren't we, in effect, managing or manipulating mental energy when we purposefully make ourselves more angry than when we started out by channeling negative thoughts through an experience? By the same token, if we think positive thoughts, we will detract emotional energy from the wound. I am sure anyone reading this book has noticed that when a person wants to stay angry, he will refuse to listen to anything that might diffuse his anger. When we refuse to listen to the voice of reason, so to speak, we are making a choice not to manage mental energy. The only reason why an angry person has to shut out the voice of reason is because he knows the information has the potential to change the way he feels. He knows that if he changes his perspective, which will, in turn, change the way he feels, he will experience a different environment on the outside. If he isn't willing to change, regardless of what the benefits may be, he will refuse to use his thoughts in a way that would allow him to experience those benefits. These examples are just a few of the many ways in which we already manipulate our mental environment to suit our purposes based on our willingness to do so. Certainly, if it is possible to manage mental energy for destructive purposes, it must also be possible to manage it for constructive purposes. The key concepts here are willingness and purpose. The willingness is to consciously direct our thoughts toward a specific intent to change something on the inside that isn't useful. Thoughts are a very powerful tool to effect changes in the mental environment. We can use them to shift, rearrange, add to, detract from, or change the polarity of various mental components. Thoughts are a form of energy, probably no different from electricity or light. They can act as a cause to produce some effect in the physical environment, as when we speak our thoughts, for example, as well as act as a cause to produce an effect in the mental environment. When we use our thoughts directed inward, we are basically using one form of energy as a tool to change the consistency and makeup of another form of energy, like using our thoughts to change a belief or release the negative energy out of a painful memory. It is precisely because of the inherent power within thoughts that people are so protective of themselves with the kinds of information, others people's thoughts expressed physically, they will expose themselves to. Everyone instinctively knows that if we allow ourselves to think about something, the thoughts have the power to change the way things exist inside of us. And once things change on the inside, we know we will perceive and experience a different outside. If we don't want to disturb the current relationship between inner and outer, we will consciously do whatever is necessary to make sure that we don't expose ourselves to anything that might threaten that relationship or think about anything in a way that would change the relationship. Change is the result of, first, a willingness to think. Personally, I believe that if we weren't meant to keep on growing mentally, adding to who we are by transcending what we have already learned, and furthermore if we weren't meant to direct that growth at a conscious level, then we would not have been given the ability to think, reason, and create. Implied within our ability to think, reason, and create is the inherent capability to learn our way out of the painful situations and dissatisfying life cycles in which we find ourselves. Painful life cycles begin with and are perpetuated by painful memories. So in essence what I am stating is that inherent within our ability to think and reason is the capability to heal our emotional wounds so that we can perceive what is available from the environment beyond our fears. Healing emotional wounds is something that we have to learn how to do by learning how to manage mental energy. Learning how to forget our painful memories by making them subconscious does not in any way reduce their significance on our perception of environmental information, or their potential to cause us to behave in certain ways. This is the gift of creativity that we were all born with. It is the capability to think beyond what our current beliefs, memories, and association would dictate as being true about the environment. The capability to reason beyond our current set of limitations, beliefs, painful memories, and erroneous associations, or use our imaginations creatively is the one compensating force that allows us to grow, improve, and evolve beyond the painful and destructive life cycles that we get caught in, both as individuals and as a culture. However, there is something here that you may need to be mindful of. A capability to do something is not necessarily an ability to do something. Before a capability becomes an ability, it has to be cultivated into a skill. For example, we can use our imaginations to visualize and then project into the environment the fulfillment of some need or goal in some future moment. But that doesn't mean we are using our imaginations creatively. We may just be using our imaginations to project what is already in our memories or what we already believe. The same is true for our thoughts. Most of the time, they will originate out of our current set of beliefs and memories, so that what we will be thinking will correspond with the status quo. To create a more satisfying future for ourselves, we need to be able to imagine this future and project it out into the environment as some future moment. There is a direct correlation between what we project and what is already inside of us, unless of course, we are imagining something beyond what we already know. The only real limitations that exist with respect to thought are those rules that were either taught to us or the ones we made up for ourselves. We are not in any way restricted to just thinking about what we already believe is true or what we have already experienced. We are free to roam anywhere in our thoughts to explore any number of possibilities and choose to act on one of them, regardless of whether it is inside or outside of the current set of rules from which we operate, even to the point of using our thoughts to change any rules that we may have that says we can't. If we weren't meant to direct our own changes by thinking about how we might learn how to lead happier and more satisfying lives, then thinking, reasoning, and creativity wouldn't exist. To experience the same kind of painful conditions over and over again, in an environment that is in constant motion, implies that we don't perceive any other choices as being available that would result in more satisfying outcomes. What we perceive is directly connected to what we already know. To perceive other choices, other than the ones our beliefs, memories, and associations lock us into, we have to know something we haven't learned yet. So, learning our way out of a situation that is perpetually dissatisfying requires that we be open to thinking beyond what we already know. The environment will always offer us an opportunity for some degree of love, harmony, happiness, and success, or some degree of despair, disappointment, anger, hate, and betrayal. What we end up with from each of these moments has to be a reflection of what is inside of us, because the environment does not interpret the information it has to offer in any given moment. That process happens exclusively in each one of us. Remember the free money example in Chapter 10? The reality of pleasure existed right along with the reality of indifference or fear. The man was there to give money to anyone who wanted. How each person interpreted the data determined what reality they experienced. Creativity is synonymous with growth and change. Doesn't the word create imply bringing into existence something that did not previously exist? If it already existed, then it would have already been created. To use our imaginations creatively, we must be willing to think outside of what we already know to be true or possible. For those of you who are not that familiar with various forms of creative thinking, you would be surprised how just the willingness to question the usefulness of something inside of us will bring forth an avalanche of inspiring alternatives. Otherwise, our memories and beliefs will cause us to think of the future in ways that directly correspond with our past, thus having the effect of locking us into the same recurring experiences. The names and places may change, but the situations and circumstances and conditions always remain the same, because we aren't changing our mental framework to perceive anything different. Necessity is the mother of invention. In other words, the need to create some new machine, device, or process to save time, save money, or make money isn't any different from the need to create a new you to experience success and a more satisfying life. The need will act as a force behind our thoughts to think beyond our current barriers so that we can expand. The barriers that act as a resisting force preventing us from expanding consist of many of our beliefs and all our painful memories. So we need a force to counteract and penetrate those barriers. That force is our thoughts and our willingness to use them in creative ways. Our lives would become a lot easier to live and potentially more satisfying if we operated out of the belief that we are in a state of imperfect knowledge, evolving towards something that we haven't become yet. Everything is evolving into something that it isn't yet. It may not seem like it at times, but each moment of each day, we change into someone who was not the person we were a moment ago. At the physical level, new cells are born and old cells die. At the mental level, each moment that passes we experience something. Each experience adds to the inner environment in the form of a memory or belief. Each memory and belief builds a self-concept that acts as a force on how we interact with the environment. Then as we interact with the environment, we change it in some way, creating a new environment for us to discover and experience. Everything that exists is evolving, because everything that exists is in motion, and motion creates change. Even the grandest mountain will eventually wear away into small rocks, which will themselves turn into sand and then dust. However, the main point here is that implied within this concept of evolution, where we are in a state of imperfect knowledge, is the view that mistakes don't exist. Mistakes just point the way to something that we haven't learned yet and obviously need to know. What exactly is a mistake anyway? We certainly weren't born with a concept or definition of what a mistake is. If left alone, all children will naturally keep on interacting with the environment to satisfy their own inner needs to learn and grow until they start to learn that what they are doing isn't quite up to the standards set by the people who are watching them. And all children just love to be watched. The criteria that we use for how we define a mistake is something that we had to learn from someone. In other words, our parents and teachers pass their definitions on to us. These definitions would represent the mental framework for their unresolved painful experiences and what they themselves haven't learned about as being available from the environment beyond their pain. In other words, we pass on our ignorance, as well as our wisdom, without knowing at the time the difference between the two. And what was passed on that was dysfunctional will be regarded as the truth just the same as the wisdom. When we as adults instill in our children our rigid definitions of what constitutes a mistake, thinking that what we are going to do is save them, all we are really doing is perpetuating our pain in the next generation. A mistake isn't resolved until we evolve in our understanding to the point where we can garner the insight that is available from the experience. When that point is reached, what we experienced is no longer a mistake or painful because of what we have learned. However, until that point is reached, if ever, we will feel compelled to save others from the painful lessons of our mistakes, even to the point of beating it into them, for their own good, of course. By using pain, either emotional or physical, as a means to save others from our mistakes, in effect what we are really doing is creating a cycle of fear. We ensure that our limited level of understanding and insight will be maintained in them because fear is a contracting force that stifles the learning process. In a very real way, we inflict the pain of our unresolved mistakes on our children just as our parents inflicted the pain of their unresolved mistakes on us. And it goes on generation after generation until someone decides to use their creative powers to break the cycle, to operate out of this belief in evolution so that we can naturally learn from the choices that we make. We have to first change our definitions of what constitutes a mistake. It is precisely these kinds of beliefs that act as mental blocks to perceive a more satisfying way of living. Mistakes are virtually synonymous with pain. We can find any number of ways to avoid acknowledging a mistake so we don't have to confront the pain, and in the process we cut ourselves off from what we need to know to grow, expand, and improve our lives.